this is basically a presentation from the point of view of iOS developers coming over to Windows Phone, sort of as a new platform for development. So this is sort of specifically aimed at that base, but I think there's probably good information comparatively on both sides here. So thanks everybody for coming. And this will probably be about a 25-minute presentation. I'll take a few questions at the end. So again, I'm Evan Kirchhoff, CTO of Cubop, which is a sort of mobile development company that does a lot of client apps, both for startups and for enterprise companies. I won't make you read this slide because it's fine print, but basically we work on all the mobile platforms, iOS, Android, Windows Phone, BlackBerry. These are probably the top 4 right now. So we've done a lot of comparative work going back and forth and thinking about how to design UI in different ways and adapt it. And specifically, we crossed over to Windows Phone with obviously a lot of Mac-based development tools. And a lot of this is kind of about how that went and how to sort of make that process easier and how to approach that. So my assumption is probably anyone coming new to Windows Phone from iOS is probably going to first try to set up a Mac-based environment for development. And this actually works. The main thing we found out pretty quickly is VMware, while was basically pretty good overall, didn't really work well as a phone development environment. It's a good product, but it's hard to run the Windows Phone simulator in it. In fact, I actually thought it was impossible because the requirements for graphic exploration and so on don't match. I met another developer last month who got to work. So it does work, but it's not really optimal. So unfortunately, even though it's a lot easier to run VMware and just have a nice little virtualized window on your Mac, it's good for a lot of things, it's probably not a good way to approach this. So we ended up going to Boot Camp, which is, of course, the Apple utility that lets you dual boot your Mac into Windows because, of course, these days, a Mac is pretty much the same hardware as Windows. It's actually a very, very good Windows laptop. I mean, the Mac Pro is a wonderful Windows environment. It just costs more than your average Windows laptop, but it's great. It's a very solid machine. And thankfully, the other things fell into place recently. So for the longest time, there was no support from Apple for running Windows 8. It only ran Windows 7. They finally added that in the Mountain Lion update 10.8.3, and now there's official driver support and so on for installing Windows 8. So it works a lot better now. There was a long period where it didn't work at all. Or it did, but it required people sort of hacking around a bit. It didn't sound like a good plan. If you're going to dual boot Windows on the Mac, pretty much try doing this. We think 100 gig partition for Windows is pretty much the minimum. I mean, 80 is okay. Below that, it's probably not that great. Windows allocates a lot of memory for install. It tends to be around 40-odd gigs, and that's not actually the size of Windows, apparently. It involves swap files or other things, but long story short, if you allocate 80 gigs, you're going to lose about half right away. So you want a decent partition, and it's a lot easier also if your machine has an optical drive. So Mac Pro works well, MacBook Air, people do it, but there's a little more messing around because you often get your Windows install disks and support software install disks burned to DVD when you download DVD images from Microsoft. And once you've done all that, I also recommend installing a lot of utilities that make life a lot easier. You want to be able to read foreign file systems, you want to handle partitions a little better, and you want to tweak a few things in the Mac hardware, and I'll go through that briefly here. And of course, definitely if you're a small development shop, join Microsoft BizSpark program. This is actually a really good thing that a lot of Apple people probably aren't as aware of as the Microsoft developer community. But this thing, which you can join, basically gives you free operating system licenses, sort of several of them. You get development tools, you get Office for Mac, you get Office for Windows. You get a pretty good cross-section of the stuff Microsoft ships, and it's all free. The basic limits are your company must be less than 5 years old and have less than $1 million annual revenue. But if you meet those things, it's a really great program, and it is what it sounds like. They give you a lot of software you can just go ahead and use. And of course, like I said, they tend to give it to you as DVD images, and then you burn DVDs, and then at that point, it's a lot easier in life if you have a way to load DVDs on your Mac. A couple utilities that seem to work really well. This is a pair of file system cross-reader utilities. There's probably other ones. There's probably some free stuff, but this one's been very reliable for us in both directions. And it basically makes the whole file system transparent. So if your Photoshop mockup or something is on the wrong side of the partition, you can go and get it and not have to reboot the entire machine. This is also really handy because inevitably you make one or the other side of your partition too small, and then it used to be really bad because it was more or less reinstall everything. This lets you instantly, but over a period of processing, drag your partitions back and forth and reallocate Mac and Windows. So that's kind of a lifesaver as well. And this thing is a utility called Trackpad++, which comes in this very terrible-looking website, but there's actually a really good utility. Because if you're switching between Mac and Windows a lot on the same machine, you've got all this motor memory about the trackpad gestures and which way the scroll bar should drag, which of course is now inverted on Mac. And this lets you fix all that stuff so you get basically the same behavior. And believe me, it makes your life a lot easier if your brain isn't always trying to think, oh, which way do I drag the mouse now? And similarly, your taste may be different here. I was going insane until I remapped the Mac keyboard, so basically Alt-Tab was still physically in the same place, even though it wasn't using the Alt-Tab keys. So there are a couple differences, obviously, in the Windows and Mac keyboard, and the more you can kind of make the motor memory work, so the better off that you are. And after all that, if you get into Windows Phone development seriously, you're probably just going to want to go buy dedicated PCs, because remember, these things are cheap. They're easily available. You can configure them to your heart's content. It's actually fun to build a custom PC. I'd sort of forgotten about that over the past few years of being primarily a Mac shop, but it is a lot of it's a lot of fun to go pick graphics cards out that are sort of 5 times faster than you're used to. So, like I said, we've been to Central Computer probably 12 times in the last decade. It's a shop here in San Francisco, but just find your own friendly PC builder or OEM and just buy some PCs. And of course, Windows laptops are also cheap. So long story short, you're probably going to migrate off a Mac development environment, even if you are an iOS developer, if you get seriously into Windows stuff. But you can definitely get away with Boot Camp in the short term, and it's a good solution. The main problem is, of course, if you're doing work on both platforms and you have to reboot your computer, that really adds a lot of friction to your workday. So for that reason alone, I mean, it's worth dropping $1,000 on a PC to sit next to your Mac. So now I want to talk a bit about the porting process and how to sort of think about going across on that, both technically and from kind of a design point of view. And yeah, I'm aware my slides are cycling a bit slowly here. I'm presenting off Keynote on the Mac over the web, so it's not as smooth as linking on PowerPoint directly. I'll try not to switch slides too quickly here. This was an older iOS app called MobiPark we released a couple of years ago. This is basically, we do apps internally kind of as a way of testing platforms, as a way of experimenting and kind of bringing out stuff in advance for client work. So this is kind of just a cute little parking utility. It has what we now call a skeuomorphic parking meter on the left-hand side. There's kind of a map to show where your car is. There's some customized UI involving picker wheels and forms and stuff on the other screens. It basically is what it looks like. It alerts you with local notifications on your phone when your meter's going to expire and shows you a map of where your car is, etc. So this is the thing we initially decided to use as an experiment in quickly porting from iOS to Windows Phone. And here is the resulting Windows Phone. So the interesting thing here is we retain pretty much all the functionality. We dropped that color picker wheel that showed you what color code your car was parked at in a multi-level lot, because it didn't seem like people were using that, but the other stuff is in here. So there's a map showing where your car is. You can drop pins on it. It gives you walking directions back to where your car is from wherever you are. There's settings that can alert you in various ways about your meter or about having to move your car for street cleaning tomorrow, and there's configurations for the settings and so on. And as you can see, the UI got a lot simpler looking, even though it's basically functionally equivalent. A lot of stuff that was kind of in fiddly screens with a lot of stuff on them in iOS have become sort of more austere screens that are buried one level down. And the top level is now this really nice panorama control, which is this smoothly scrolling thing that the Windows people know about and the iOS people might not. But the signature feature of Windows Phone apps that's, we think, really beautiful is the use of this sort of parallax scrolling, wide, sideways moving top level where you can present a lot of cool stuff and kind of make a really design-forward appearance for your app. So basically everything changed in the UI, except we replicated that parking meter controller because that turned out to be kind of the thing everyone recognized in the old app. So as an experiment, we sort of carried that across and built a custom control that did the same thing, and what we're essentially doing here is emulating the iOS picker wheel in a completely foreign environment. But it actually worked out. We wrote it in XAML and uses the same fonts, and it basically looks the same. It's kind of interesting because it's not at all a Windows Phone control, but we think it kind of works in this context because the rest of the app is basically very much the sort of modern style. And this is kind of dropped in, and it's the one piece that kind of deviates, but we think it works. So, like I said, we basically had to replicate what is a lightly skinned iOS picker view in a much more manual way. We had to write little physics equations for the wheels having momentum, and when you spin them, they spin for a while and decelerate, and then come to a stop, and then it reads the value. So it isn't actually as bad as it sounds because it came out of Flash development. It's the same sort of technique. You write little physics equations for motion, and things look like they have mass, and it works pretty well. So this actually was not that bad of a project. We ported the app really pretty quickly, and pretty much half the work was in this one control. And this is readable, so it's basically just showing that there's kind of a simple state machine inside the code, and it looks for what state the wheels are in and decelerates, and then puts the appropriate values in the little text fields and so on. So the next thing we looked at porting was a utility app we did internally, and it's actually gotten really popular. I mean, it's free, but it's used daily by probably mid-tens of thousands of people. And this is a GPS-based mileage tracking program that is sort of famous for having one-button operation. You get in your car, you push start. It tracks you using GPS and is a background process on the iPhone. And when you get to where you are, you push stop, and then it lets you log some basic stuff for taxes or for expensing and so on. So we really wanted to port, but in Windows Phone 7 we couldn't do it because the background processes were pretty limited. You really couldn't get GPS updates in the background. You can get, or you could, but they were sort of limited to things like every 15 minutes and fairly rough. So it didn't seem like it was going to work at all. We just deferred this project and didn't think about porting it. And now we're still working on this, but from what we're understanding, this will work fine in Windows Phone 8. There's a lot more iOS-like level of background processes. And now, iOS, of course, doesn't actually multitask per se, but it does let you register for background services that will keep going. And this, I think, roughly speaking, is sort of the model in Windows Phone 8 now. So our sense of the platform overall is you can port roughly the same stuff across in terms of background processes from iOS. Probably different than Android, but it does seem very iOS-like. But of course, like I was saying, you can't go ahead and replicate your UI. So iOS and Android now tend to share a lot of UI in popular commercial apps like Foursquare because the paradigm is similar enough that you can get away with using a lot of your design again. You can maybe have to move the tabs from the bottom to the top, as you can see in the first two images here, but you don't have to make that many concessions to the platform anymore. It kind of involves a design language that is fairly neutral across iOS and Android now, just for pure commercial reasons. On Windows Phone, of course, you don't get to do that, and you shouldn't do that. It's a very different platform, and they're trying to present stuff in different ways and have different interaction patterns. And so, as in this example here, Foursquare is completely reimagined into kind of a very panoramic app. This is actually an older version of Foursquare Windows Phone, but the new one is the same kind of style. It's very picture-forward, stuff at the top level. It's a completely different interface than the vertical scrolling thing you see on the left-hand side. So, again, this is sort of stuff aimed at iOS developers in terms of map of the territory, but panoramic control is very popular design pattern, and it's not the only slide-way scrolling control on Windows Phone, and you can tell which one is which by the fact that the panoramic control cues you on the right-hand side of the screen with a little 24-pixel preview of the content in the panel to the right of that. So they call it the peak. So the panoramic cues you that there is more stuff on the screen by showing you a bit of stuff that's cut off on the edge that you can't see yet to encourage you to kind of drag over there. And if you're porting an app from iOS, this is a very crude equivalency, but you kind of want to think of the panorama as kind of the tab bar of Windows Phone. It's kind of the major top-level navigation pattern. It's basically a way to sort of present the main features of the app in some sense or other. So it's sort of conceptually similar to the tab bar in iOS or the other tab bar in Android. And this is the pivot control, which looks similar but doesn't have that peeking feature on the right-hand side. It does tend to push the titles on top closer together, so that's your cue again that there's stuff off the screen you can't see yet, and you should kind of drag over to it. This is more, it's used in various ways. It is sometimes top-level navigation, sometimes it's second-level navigation, and it's kind of like this segmented control thing in iOS where you're picking between mutually exclusive options and essentially a set of parallel views inside your program that sort of have the same layout but do different stuff. So it's like, for example, the segmented control inside the iOS App Store on the iPhone. You have a mutually exclusive picker for new apps, what's hot apps, and Genius apps. And you're going to see three kind of versions of the same screen. You just pick back and forth. And then this application bar thing is just kind of more here than meets the eye because there's initially some icons, and often you can pop that up another level, and there's other options underneath it. So this is sort of a combination of the functionality we're used to from the iOS toolbar and the thing you used to see on the Android menu button that would pop up some more options from the bottom of the screen. And interestingly, Android's kind of evolving away from this pattern a bit, but it's the same kind of stuff. There's this hidden menu at the bottom, and people are used to seeing that. So the big thing is because your top-level UI tends to be a draggable piece, unlike iOS, you don't want to nest draggable things inside that draggable piece. We actually tried this. So this is the first version of MobiPark, and we had the map basically working as an inline control, which is a lot more sexy in various ways. You could drag the little square map around. You could plot your car directly on it. And this seemed really cool, and people really hated it. You would hand them the phone to play with it if they hadn't seen it before. And their reaction was sort of, one person said, I don't know where to touch this. They really did not like a thing that dragged one way on the outside layer and a thing that dragged the other way inside. And of course, this is just against Microsoft guidelines anyway, and this is the reason why, and people just don't like it and they're confused by it. So the correct way is to freeze the map tile here. So it's showing you some preview of content, but when you touch it, it drills down into a second level screen, and that's the actual map control. It's full screen, it has other options on it. So the correct way to do this is to drop your draggable stuff one level down, not put them in the panorama. And this even extends to things like draggable Boolean switches, like on-off switches. Don't put them in the panorama. Stick them down because you don't want draggable stuff on a draggable screen. And of course, unlike iOS, there's a hardware back button on all Windows phones. It's even more enforced in the Android hardware back button, so you can rely on it always being there, and you should use that to back out of lower level stuff and not add back buttons to the screen. So this is a really big principle. Take the back button on Windows Phone seriously. Don't add your back buttons as UI inside your app. Use the hardware back button for basically all kinds of backup operations, from closing dialog, dismissing the keyboard, moving back up one level in the navigation tree. And don't use the back button to slide things around sideways. I've never seen this actually happen, but apparently some people have done it at some point. So the back button is just to kind of pop up back one level in the stack of views you have on the screen. So this slide's important because this is the single biggest conceptual hurdle people hit coming from iOS to Windows 8 and Windows Phone 8 development. And I explain this to developers in iOS still, and they're still surprised by it. So the way that Apple and Microsoft divide up the territory, what's mobile and what's not mobile, is actually different. And the tablets are the thing that falls on the other side. So in the iOS world, we used to thinking of the tablet as basically a big iPhone, conceptually speaking. It runs the same apps. And the iPad and the iPhone are essentially one sort of unified platform. They're kind of the same thing. A lot of people have both. They expect the same apps on both. They expect to buy it once and get it on both devices. This world, and this is for obvious historical reasons. Microsoft has typically come from the desktop with a very strong power of market strength. And presumably for that reason, they've conceptualized the tablet as sort of a extensively desktop platform, not an extension of the phone platform, to the point where if you boot up a Surface and interact with it, it calls itself a PC. It doesn't call itself a tablet. So obviously it is a tablet form factor. It's a very nice device. It's light and it's cool and it's powerful, but it's running desktop operating systems. And the surprising thing from the iOS side is there's no sort of normal path of deploying the same binary app to the Windows tablet and the Windows Phone. And it's even hard to do it from the same code base in certain ways. So the iOS world looks like this. You create a new project in Xcode, and it says, look, you want to make an iPad, an iPhone, or a universal app, and it defaults to universal because a lot of apps are basically universal these days. Universal just means iPad plus iPhone. And once you've got that, and this is just template Apple code here in the bottom. Don't worry about reading it, but the key part is you can test in your code at any branch point, am I on an iPhone or iPad? You test user interface idiom equals UI user face idiom iPhone, and you branch on that. And then you probably can't necessarily read this code depending on the screen size, but what this code below is doing is it's testing for the presence of the iPhone, and then it's conditionally loading different view controllers and basically different nib files, which are layout files for iOS, depending whether the thing's an iPhone or an iPad. So you're shipping both in one app, and it's just branching. So these are some good starting point resources for thinking about how to do dual deployment for Windows Phone 8 versus Windows 8. It's sort of a porting process. It's kind of interesting. You can definitely share code libraries in various ways. From what we're reading so far, it's not quite as simple as conditional compilation in your code base. You might have to actually have two projects. It depends on your code and how complicated the code is, but it's definitely not any kind of environment where you write a line of code saying, am I on a phone or tablet? The XAML syntax is apparently different between Windows Phone 8 and Windows sort of Desktop Metro. So depending on what you're doing, it's worth kind of looking at the MSDN documents and kind of seeing the best approach to it, because there's probably a variety of different approaches you could be taking. And then finally, just a bit about the Microsoft mobile tool chain and how it feels coming from the iOS tool chain side. So the good news is, even though you're probably going to redesign your UI, the development is a lot faster. I mean, this is a very, very crude metric, but based on our experimenting with our own apps and our early work with client apps, in some ways you have a 4-to-1 advantage in both time and code size versus iOS. This is probably because there's a lot more, if you will, sort of template framework stuff built into the whole Microsoft environment. So your apps are very pretty by default. The default templates are beautiful. You get a lot of really sexy OpenGL features like parallax scrolling and various layers, and all this stuff just kind of works without real programming. So you get a lot of nice stuff for free. It also seems to be the case that you spend less time doing custom UI work, which is good or bad depending. There's definitely a more strong sense of kind of a Microsoft style in these apps because it is a new platform and they're trying to teach people interaction patterns of the platform. So it makes sense the apps are kind of more similar than the iOS apps these days, which are very experimental. So you spend less time doing custom UI. On the other hand, if you have a client who wants really experimental UI, then it's less clear how to do that because stuff is really meant to fall into these kind of well-defined patterns at this point. So the platform assumes a fairly reasonable degree of UI standardization across the apps, more so than current iOS development. And again, this is a very crude metric, but these two apps, I mean, two utility app, but the iOS version is over 4 times bigger in code than the Windows Phone version. And again, some of this seems to be because you just get a lot more stuff built into the Windows Phone framework. And the actual binary size is also kind of shocking. I believe the Windows Phone app is sort of 1.2 megabytes, which is, on a floppy. And again, that's because there appears to be a lot more shared library stuff in the Windows Phone platform, whereas in iOS, you're constantly kind of re-including various framework libraries over and over again. At least, as far as we can tell, that's why there's such a dramatic difference in binary size. And again, here are the default templates for Windows Phone design patterns. They give you a panorama app, a pivot app. These are kind of your major design patterns, and they just kind of work out of the box, and they work really well. So if you want to get an app deployed quickly, you can start with one of these things and customize it and add data hooks and whatever fairly rapidly, and you're really good to go. And this is just a small chunk of the code you get generated automatically, but it really puts a lot of code into the app templates, probably a lot more code and a lot more functionality than you get in the Xcode/iOS app templates. And finally, even though there are multiple screen sizes for Windows Phone now, it's not that bad. There's basically 3 resolutions, there's 2 aspect ratios, so it's roughly the same load on your design as developing for the 2 iPhones right now, the iPhone 5 and the iPhone 4. So it's nowhere like the Android world of having lots and lots of devices and form factors and the sort of fragmentation problem. It's really a fairly unified platform, even with the new devices. So you really can do more or less one design and adapt it really easily to all the current Windows phones on the market. So that is pretty much a digest of what you want to know, I think, coming from iOS to Windows Phone. And there's a few minutes left, and I can probably do a few questions here before we end the session.
Okay, great. Thanks a bunch, Evan. We did have a few questions come through. I'll try to get through them here in the time we have left. First off, what resources did you use when you first started developing for Windows?
So for learning resources, I just went to Safari Books Online, that tech ebook service I subscribe to, and just pulled a couple of books and read them really quickly. It actually was a very fast spin-up period. I think because I was the first one in our company to experiment with this, I think I went from not really knowing much and having not used Visual Studio to being viable in about 2 weeks. And it's pretty easy to learn, and also the tools are good because Visual Studio, which I've always heard for years but hadn't tried yet, is a very nice development environment that gives you a lot of code hinting, so you can intuitively figure out a lot of stuff. So I basically read, I think, one or two books, and after that I just went to the Microsoft Online docs.
Great. Hey, one other question. We had a couple other questions, but one of them was, why did you select Boot Camp over Parallels? Would you recommend Boot Camp over Parallels?
It seems to be that it's hard to get either good performance or even compatible performance with the simulator unless you more or less run a pure Windows partition and boot the machine in Windows as opposed to using virtualization. I don't know if Parallels actually would work. We haven't tried it. We tried VMware first, but it just seemed like you really want to be as close to metal as possible, so it's easier just to boot the Mac into Windows.
Okay, great. We have one final question for you that came through. What are your experiences in using Apple's tools and Objective-C compared to Visual Studio and C#? Which set of development tools do you think is better?
Visual Studio is probably better development software. Like you said, it's kind of famous for being the one everyone likes, better than, say, Eclipse and Xcode. So I like the physical software, the development software probably better on the Microsoft side. Language-wise, I actually like Objective-C. A lot of people don't, but the Apple APIs, I think, are really well done. So I think I have a slightly easier time thinking in Objective-C at this point. But for messing with code and projects and typing stuff out and getting hinting and support, yeah, Visual Studio is really good. I think it's probably the best thing of the four development environments we have.